Hello class, welcome to your first of many lectures on the pre-Socratic philosophers. This week we're looking at the Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. This is one of my favorite areas in all philosophy, so forgive the excessive number of lecture notes. In order to keep this video to under an hour, I may skip over some of the details lightly, but you can always read the lecture notes yourself. Watching these videos and at least looking through the lecture notes is the one thing that I hope to require from everyone as the course proceeds, as that will keep us all on the same page with what we're learning and also give us general overviews so that you can make a more informed selection when there are options as to what to do your assessments on. The pre-Socratic philosophers are often said to be the world's first philosophers. I consider this view to be terribly Eurocentric. That Western philosophy began in Greece and only in Greece is true in regards to Western philosophy, but attempts to differentiate Western philosophy, say as science, from Egyptian, Indian, or Chinese philosophy is an anachronism with little basis in the surviving evidence. Philosophy emerges in the Axial Age along with Homer and the Bible, and something similar happens in India and China, and possibly also earlier in Babylonia and Egypt. Early Greek philosophers are sometimes called monists because they sought to isolate one thing, usually one of the elements, as the basic stuff to which all reality could be reduced. It is said that their ancient efforts paved the way to the scientific method. In this course, we'll be looking more into the geopolitical causes, implications of Greek philosophy, its cultural and technological cosmopolitanism. And I hope to suspend from the start any naive distinction of philosophy and science, or philosophy-science versus myth and religion. Heidegger's chronology of the pre-Socratics focuses on the question of being. It is the question of the being of the world, or nature, physis, that animates the Milesian philosophy of nature until the time of the Sophists. Classical or Athenian philosophy, the question of the being of human Dasein, or existence, is appropriated more radically through Socrates, and it is in this context that the problems of scientific philosophy receive a more fundamental elaboration in Plato and Aristotle. This is followed for Heidegger by a decline, weakening, and deformation. That is, into the practical worldview of the philosophy of Hellenism, the Stoics, Epicureans, and Skeptics. Nevertheless, in these philosophical schools, a certain type of philosophical life is preserved. Lastly, following the religious speculations of Neoplatonism, there is an intrusion of speculation deriving from Christian theology. Precursor to the pre-Socratics, not included in Deal's first edition, but in later editions indeed included, is Pherecydes of Syros. Demotelos writes he seems to be the first thinker who attempted a proto-cosmological explanation of creation myth. Aristotle quotes him as the first philosopher who blends the mythical with the non-mythical. His work, the Heptamouchia, probably the first work in Greek prose, postulated three everlasting self-creative principles: the Greek god Zeus, or Zas, Chronos, time, and Chthoni, an ionic form of the feminine Chithonia, earth. Zas, as god of the moment and transformation, undergoes a sacred wedding with Chthoni. This seems to be a shamanistic cosmogony, equally religious and philosophical. The Heptamouchos itself translates as the seven-chambered cosmos and posits phenomenological stages connected to natural places and metaphors for the true perception of what is. Another work by Pherecydes is thought to be Theocrasia, or divine mingling, sometimes also called Theogonia. So Hesiod wasn't the only one to write Theogonies. In some Testimonia, Pherecydes, like Thales, gives water as the first cause and calls it chaos, probably borrowing the term from Hesiod. Bart Graves suggests Pherecydes is closely connected to early Orphism through the figure of Ophionius. As we hear in later Apollonius of Rhodes, and he, Orpheus, sang of how first of all Ophion and Eurynome, daughter of Ocean, held sway on snowy Olympus. The Orphic influence on early Greek religious and philosophical speculation is often underestimated. Classical times, Orphism was best known as a religion of the book, a hubbub of books according to Plato. The Orphic poems in circulation are various. In the Eudemian cosmogony, Orpheus posits Okeanos and Tethys as the first gods, ocean and flow. The most cited cosmogony poeticizes the archgods as Chronos, time, and Androseia, or Anarche, necessity. In both Pherecydes and Orpheus, Chronos, or time, is one of the earliest deities. When the egg of time necessity splits, ether is separated from Erebus, the upper world, from the lower world of darkness, and Phanes emerges, also called Bromius, Erikbios, and Eros. Scepter of rulership is first owned by Phanes, but then passed to night. Then to Gaia, Earth, Uranos, Heaven, the Titans, Kronos and Zeus. Clearly Greek theogonic cosmogony was not fixed, but underwent a process of philosophical self-reflection and revision. In the Orphic vision of salvation, the final and most important child of Zeus is Dionysus, in the earlier form of Zagreus, who, along with Persephone, are the savior and mediating gods of all divine mortal experience for human beings. Here you see a map of the Orphic cosmogony. Of course, this is still a very mythological and religious level of philosophical speculation, but in my view, is nonetheless very philosophical tenets of Orphic belief that we'll see reinstantiated in several of the major pre-Socratic philosophers include the idea of purity of soul through katharmoi, or purifications, and telete, or ritual initiations, bringing about a liberation of our divine nature. For the Orphics, as for later Platonists and Gnostics, the body is corrupt, a tomb of sorts, muddying the passage to our blessedness, as Orphic and Eleusinian initiates hoped to experience in the afterlife. Contrary to popular belief, the Orphics were the first to invent the idea of original sin. We inherit the corruption of the Titans who slew Dionysus and ate him, and also meat eating is criminal, as is animal sacrifice, a trait Orphic communities shared with the Pythagoreans. Again, like the Pythagoreans, the Orphics introduced the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, and their ultimate goal was an apotheosis or theosis, a union with divine spirit brought about through telestic henosis, that is, a ritualistic unifying of divinity and humanity through special rites. In the midst of all these mythico-religious clouds, it often seems that Thales is the first philosopher. Thales was born and thrived in Miletus, a prosperous port town in Asia Minor in the east, and was possibly of Semitic ancestry. According to Aristotle, he was the founder of physical science. Possible titles of his books include Nautical Astronomy, On the Solstice, and On the Equinox. The only two verbatim quotes we have are "Everything is full of gods," and "Water is the indwelling source of all things." And maybe also "The earth floats on water." He definitely seems to be the inventor of material monism. And in regards to the cosmos, he was apparently quite the wanderer, always looking at the sky, sometimes to his detriment, and more interested in philosophy, yet capable of profitable skill, as he proved on several occasions. All sources for him, Theophrastus, Simplicius, seem to depend on Aristotle's discussion. More from the Testimonia on the life of Thales. Apparently he was involved in politics and then turned to natural philosophy. He claimed that souls are immortal and understood the soul as the source of motion, just like the lodestone which magnetizes iron. He gave inanimate things a portion of soul, like the magnet and amber. He's reputed to have been the first Greek to create a consistent 365-day solar calendar, Greek time being measured in lunations. He discovered the obliquity of the zodiac and the cycle of the great year, and said that stars are earthly but still have fire in them. Some give him credit for inventing the Pythagorean theorem regarding right-angled triangles, whereupon he sacrificed an ox. From his advances in science, we can be sure that he applied complex mathematics successfully to trading routes and exchange negotiations in the prosperous port town of Miletus. The philosopher is already in Thales an applied scientist. He probably studied in Egypt or Babylonia, or maybe was just exposed to Egyptian and Babylonian philosophy through living in a more cosmopolitan town, and his nautical star guide may have helped the ascendancy of Milesian trade. He possibly said, "If you tell them that you learned from me, you will have recompensed me for your education." Thales became most famous for predicting an eclipse in the 4th year of the 48th Olympia, and another one 170 years later. His second most famous deed was helping a military campaign by diverting a river. At one time, he responded to the charge that philosophy is impractical by studying weather patterns, investing in an olive grove and press at the right time, and making a fortune, thereby, quote, demonstrating that it is easy for philosophers to get rich if they wish, but that's not what they care about. According to Diogenes, what Thales really proved here is that the best way to make money is to create a monopoly for oneself. So maybe Thales is the inventor of monopolism. His death, like the deaths of all the pre-Socratic philosophers related in Diogenes, is humorous. He was so busy studying the stars that he fell into a well, and a Thracian maiden laughed at him famously well. In regards to Thales' material monism or water doctrine, in Greek hudor, its scientific aspect is explained by Aristotle. With a few paraphrase quotes, "This is the element, this is the principle of existing things. For all else comes to be while this is preserved. Water is the source of growth for moist things." Aristotle speculates on some of the empirical phenomena from which Thales may have drawn his theory, especially that the seeds or semina of all things living have a moist nature. Scholars are divided as to how to interpret Thales' doctrine. According to the material principle interpretation, everything is made out of water, but according to the originative principle interpretation, water is simply the source of everything, subsequent things acquiring the forms of different substances. Thales' water doctrine seems to have not been intended merely scientifically, but to have had a religious intention as well. In more paraphrases from the Testimonia, "And the things of the world travel and flow and are carried by the nature of the first element of their coming to be, and this is God, who has neither beginning nor end." Thales was also following an ancient tradition, already mentioned from Orpheus, Homer, and others, which made Oceanus and Tethys the parents of coming to be. The second, only probably verbatim surviving quotation from Thales is "Everything is full of gods." Certainly this is the most interesting of his doctrines in terms of the philosophy of religion. But is it a statement of pantheism, the doctrine that nature itself is thoroughly divine and itself a god or the source of all gods, or less strongly of animism, the doctrine that the gods are responsible for everything in and within the play of the world? It is significant that the Greek word for gods in Thales' saying is sometimes recorded as theos, that is the normal Greek word for God, the divine, the gods, and sometimes also as daimones, a complicated word we'll see a lot in this course, meaning spirit, spiritual agency, or demi-divine intelligence. The connection between the water doctrine and the all things are full of gods doctrine is not apparent, but fascinating. But Thales, it seems, there is something divine about the prime element water, since it is what all things are made of and what connects all things in the world through the flux of becoming. Like water, the gods are everywhere in and suffusing the watery play of the world. It is Diogenes' later citation, "The world is animate and full of deities," which uses the term daimonon, whereas in Aristotle, all things are full of gods, theon. Diogenes also has kosmon in place of panta, the world in place of all things, and he adds the word emsukon, that is, to be ensouled. According to analytic ancient philosophers such as Kirk, Raven, and Schofield, Aristotle is to be preferred, Diogenes' citation relying on an unscrupulous Stoic influence, or recognizably fictitious opinion comparable to the 30,000 daimons in Hesiod's Works and Days. So what's at stake in this debate? Did Thales say daimons or gods? I find the analytic dismissal a heavy-handed resolution of a nuanced semantic nexus that moves between daimones and gods. Why should we prefer Aristotle's rarefied theological language to that of the so-called spiritualists? Well, only because we're concerned with preserving Thales' reputation as a scientific philosopher. It is interesting that Heidegger quotes Thales' fragment from Diogenes, "All beings are full of demons," and explains this in terms of hylozoism, the idea that spirit is not something added on to matter, but that spirit and soul or matter are ultimately the same thing in a pre-separated condition. Either way, whether Thales is speaking of daimons or gods, a divine power pervades the elemental motion and moves it. This is a hardly strictly scientific doctrine. This prejudice in favor of reading Thales strictly scientifically, other than religiously, because he is, after all, the first philosopher, extends the discussion regarding his work on the solstice and on the equinox. To be sure, there's a strongly scientific dimension. The Greek Mediterranean climate knew only 3 seasons: summer, winter, or spring, or agriculturally sowing, spring, and harvest. If Thales is the discoverer of the solstices and the equinoxes and the cross-quarter days and the 365-day year, this was surely based on some very complicated mathematical observations. Was Thales' discovery merely scientific and practical, or did it have a religious and cultic dimension? Where in Diogenes we hear about the existence of these 2 texts, there is an interesting clarification as to their authorial intention. Thales wrote these texts since he judged everything else to be unknowable. The easy way out here is to say only that which is strictly scientifically knowable is knowable. This is just one of many translations of the Greek phrase. Young completely reverses this meaning in his 19th century translation. Thales wrote about the solstices and the equinoxes because they are a very difficult problem and most of the things are much easier to grasp. We're substituting alla katalepta from a katalepta. Recently, Graham gives us considering the rest of his theory to be inaccessible. That is, highlighting the exoteric aspects of Thales' work versus the more esoteric or hidden aspects. Everything hinges on how we understand the word kataleptikos, which is a word going back to Homer and means to seize, overpower, lay hold of. In Herodotus and Thucydides, it means to conquer or check, legally bind or constrain, and in the Sophists and Plato, to apprehend and comprehend. Sticking with a katalepta, my view is the superior accessibility of the solstices and equinoxes refers not just to their being proven by scientific demonstration, but to the true nature of the cosmos. The religious openness or accessibility of these 4 special days in the calendar, light or darkness being the most powerful during the solstices, and light and darkness being equalized during the equinoxes. Say only the solstices and the equinoxes can be known, may indeed be a temporal doctrine, a religious doctrine of temporality. Anaximander, who we'll spend quite a bit more time on, was a student of Thales and his successor at a school that arguably also taught Anaximenes and Pythagoras. Aristotle says he was the first to compose a treatise on nature, Periphusios. For Anaximander, the arche or origin of all things is no material principle within them, but the apeiron, the boundless or the infinite. All finite things are limited and eventually return to their true origin in the infinite. The apeiron is a word much more abstract and absolute than Thales' hudor. Again, we only have 2 verbatim quotations for Anaximander, arche apeiron, and the so-called justice fragment, which explains how it works. For Anaximander, all worlds are the product of conflicting finite opposites within the apeiron, and they, quote, pay reparation to each other according to the assessment of time for their injustices, a bit like karma. Anaximander thus speaks of the differentiation of the many finite things as well as their reunification in the apeiron. This occurs through vortical motion. Since in vortical motion, like attracts like, and unlike elements are separated. We're not sure if Anaximander used the words genesis and phetheron, or coming to be and passing away, but these words do describe his cosmovision governed by justice, or decay. Importantly for Anaximander, justice is a process rooted in isonomy, or the equality of equal relationships. All things continue to exist so long as they don't violate their boundaries and mess with other things. Accordingly, in cosmology, as in human society, respect and reckoning for the finite processes of becoming is important. Anaximander's justice fragment, rooted in the idea isonomia, may well here be nascently democratic. In the Testimonia, helpfully summarized by Stamatelos, the apeiron is described as everlasting, unborn, ageless, deathless, and indestructible, unrestricted in space, inexhaustible in mass, and indefinite. It is thus the beyond of all finite oppositions and opposites, the first statement of the principle of the unity of opposites. Anaximander's apeiron may seem to be a scientific doctrine. The universe itself is infinite in its production of finite worlds. It's also understood in Anaximander as a religious principle. For the apeiron, it is the divine, deathless, and imperishable. This is pretty neat. The infinite itself is the ultimate source and object of our religious devotion. Anaximander is reputed to have a number of other odd and interesting doctrines, such as the stars are chariot wheels or tubes connecting cosmic filaments of ether. In other words, fly up to the stars in a spaceship and you can travel through them to other parts of the universe, a bit like how some scientists today speculate on black holes. Anaximander also has the distinction of apparently being the first climate scientist. The Earth is drying out and we are doomed. There may be a plurality of worlds, however. At this point, Anaximander sounds like pure modern science fiction. The sun stays in its allotted place through its motion because it rides on the air like a frisbee, and thunder and lightning are caused by wind condensed into clouds, not by Zeus. Humans originated from other animals, fish in particular, so Anaximander is the first evolutionist of the Greek thinkers. And lastly, that balance and isonomy among existing things is needed for ours and the world's survival. For Heidegger, Anaximander's thought of the apeiron as the arche is a genuine inception of the experience of being, and reflects profound meditation on the question, how can what is original, lying at the foundation of beings, itself be one of those beings? So Anaximander becomes the first thinker for Heidegger of what he calls the ontological difference. For Heidegger's Anaximander, there are worlds in all dimensions, and the worlds are gods. And he notes that Aristophanes, in the comic play The Clouds, calls Anaximander an atheoi. Heidegger, who himself promotes the atheism of thinking, although is not an anti-religious thinker, prefers to speak less of Anaximander's theology than of the exertion needed to grasp being itself. How difficult it really is to think of the infinity of a being which is prior to all beings, including the gods. And lastly, he views Anaximander's indeterminate, or apeiron, in a special relation to Aristotle's theory of the prime substance. For our textbook, Anaximander's main innovation is the idea that motion is never-ending, and that never-ending motion is vortical, which sounds a bit like an early theory of gravity. The Earth is fixed at the center of the cosmos due to an equilibrium of surrounding, presumably vortex forces, and the textbook points out that Anaximander's genesis of all finite things from the apeiron sounds a bit like an early version of the Big Bang theory. Our longest actual citation of Anaximander, his quoted words in bold here, goes, "The source from which all things arise, they return to of necessity when they are destroyed, for they suffer punishment and make reparation to one another for their injustice, according to the assessment in time," he, Anaximander, says in somewhat poetical terms. The bulk of Nietzsche's and the later Heidegger's interpretation focuses on this fragment, so let's turn to their respective interpretations now. Nietzsche's philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks was written after the birth of tragedy, but close to it in his intellectual biography. Nietzsche was delivering lectures in Basel on the pre-Platonic philosophers, which you can also find in translation, as well as several essays on the limits of philology, the Greek state, and the concept of truth. His aim in philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks is to get to know the characters of the pre-Socratics, their larger-than-life personalities. Note that this is a few years before Diehl's publication of the pre-Socratic fragments, and that Nietzsche sees Plato as the hinge, not Socrates, speaking of the pre-Platonic philosophers. Nietzsche defines his task in the work: whoever rejoices in great human beings will also rejoice in philosophical systems, even if they are completely erroneous. They always have one wholly incontrovertible point: personal mood, color. The task is to bring to light what we must ever love and honor, and what no subsequent enlightenment can take away: great individual human beings. According to Nietzsche, philosophy is sick. The physicians of our culture should repudiate it. The Romans did their best to live without philosophy, but they failed, and their empire, along with Greek and Roman philosophy, went down. Philosophy may be helpful and healthy to a healthy culture, but the sick it makes sicker. For Nietzsche, the pre-Socratic era was the last time when philosophy was healthy and part of a healthy culture, and had a shaping, beneficent influence. Nietzsche is always several steps ahead of his time, especially here in his railings against the Greek myth of an autochthonous origin of philosophy. Nothing would be sillier than to claim an autochthonous, that is, indigenous development of philosophy for the Greeks. They invariably absorbed every other living culture, that is to say, they were cosmopolitan. At least and especially the Ionian philosophers were. The Greek genius lies in a principle of selection, their inventiveness always taking place within the purview of tradition. What they invented was the archetypes of a higher philosophical thought. Nietzsche's short list of most important pre-Platonic philosophers includes Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Democritus, and Socrates. He sees them as monolithic great characters, exemplars of life devoid of conventionality, whose lives, existing in a magnificent solitude within the polis, was devoted to the cultivation of insight, mind alone. In this era, the Greek philosophers were still sages. They were not seduced by the temptation of increasing secularization, and were not excessive sensualists. They were cosmopolitans, but always within a tragic wisdom. that differentiated itself both from an excessive enlightenment and from a grotesque hieroglyphics of religion. In a way, the Greeks were the sages who plotted what Buddha would call the middle course. Crucial for Nietzsche's outlook is the idea that we should characterize the earlier Greek philosophers as pre-Platonic, or a republic of creative minds, were the essential prerequisite of Plato's philosophy, since Plato mixed them all together on a grand scale. Socratic, Pythagorean, and Heraclitean elements all combine in Plato's doctrine of ideas. Nietzsche mourns intensely, and I concur, what a misfortune it is that so little of their works has survived. We are only more favorably disposed towards Plato and Aristotle because we have more to read. I've often prayed to the gods of archaeology. If I could have but one text from the ancient world that has been lost, it would doubtless be Heraclitus' treatise on Phusis. By all accounts, both testimony and their influence, the pre-Socratics wrote exceptionally interesting books. For Nietzsche, writing good books is more rare than we might think, and only happens about once or twice a century, if we're lucky. In Thales, Nietzsche points out the initial absurdity of the proposition that water is the primal origin and womb of all things. It is for Nietzsche a doctrine intended to provoke, first by telling us about the primal origin of all things, second by doing so in a language devoid of image and fable. Already in Thales, Nietzsche hears Heraclitus' statement that hen kai pan, all things are one. For Nietzsche, the all things are full of God statement leaves Thales in the company of religion and superstition, but his water doctrine establishes him as a natural scientist. What drove Thales was a metaphysical conviction that had its origin in a mystic intuition. So the origins of science are in fact mystical and religious. Philosophical thinking has little to do with calculation and measurement. Rather, its feet are propelled by an alien, illogical power, the power of the creative imagination. Within the power of creative imagination, according to Nietzsche, we find two intimately related paths, mythic thinking and scientific philosophy. Nietzsche dares to ask the question, is philosophy really no more than a poetics of imaginative concepts? This would be a misstep. Thales' statement is novel, and its value lies precisely in the fact that it was meant non-mythically and non-allegorically. It is a statement of reality, not the modern concept of poetics. Nevertheless, new concepts have to be expressed within the veils of metaphor, myth, and semblance, the play of illusion to be understood. Why? Because the Greeks find it incredibly difficult to comprehend concepts as such. Here we see glimmerings of Nietzsche's overall account of the pre-Socratics as the inventors of the concept. For Nietzsche, even the early Greek philosophers barely had concepts in the modern sense. And this is what distinguishes us from them. We are so at home in abstractions, in concepts, whereas the Greeks had to invent them, since in their creative imagination, they were much more at home in mythemes. Leave it to Nietzsche to be right about most things, for he points to the highly conspicuous Orphic movement as having the capacity to comprehend and think abstractions without concrete aids to an even greater degree than Thales did. What limited the Orphic religion was its reliance on allegorical form. And Pherecydes of Syros, too, is chronologically and in several empirical concepts close to Thales, his utterances hovering in that middle region where mythology and allegory are wed. What a beautiful vision. For Nietzsche, the philosophers distinguished themselves from the mythologists because of their sagacious or wise taste. Against the backdrop of obscure allegorical philosophizing, they emerged as creative masters who carved a way into the depth of nature without the help of fantastic fable. They both used and passed over the methods of science and of proof in ancient Greece as today, a typical characteristic of the philosophic mind. Nietzsche traces the Greek word for sage etymologically to sapia, I taste, sapiens, he who tastes, Sisyphus, the man of keenest taste. Philosopher, we'll learn later, is the lover of wisdom, doesn't necessarily have wisdom and always approaches it asymptotically. The sage is the one who knows, who tastes the fruit of the tree of knowledge, sharply savoring and selecting, meaningfully discriminating, and translating his wisdom to the peculiar art of the philosopher into the vision of a people. According to this understanding of the first philosophers as sages, philosophy is definitely not science. It is distinguished from science by its selectivity and discrimination, that is, its focus on the extraordinary. the astonishing or awe-inspiring, the difficult and the divine. This was how Aristotle defined the philosopher in his Metaphysics. And so philosophy has nothing to do with intellectual cleverness and its emphasis on finite conceptual distinctions, which often prove useless. Science, and we might say today much of analytic philosophy, rush headlong, without spiritual selectivity, without taste, at whatever is knowable, in the blind desire to know at any cost. Philosophical thinking, on the other hand, exemplified by the pre-Socratic sages, is always on the scent of those things which are most worth knowing, the great and important insights. For Nietzsche, the animating drive of the philosopher is that he seeks to hear within himself the echoes of a world symphony and to reproject them in the form of concepts. The philosopher is contemplative and perceptive like the artist, compassionate like the religious, and a seeker of purposes and causalities like the scientist. His fundamental drive, however, differentiating him from these other pursuits, is a quest for self-possession. As Novalis said, a desire to be everywhere at home in the world and to transform oneself into alien bodies and speak in alien tongues, to bring this extraordinary vision of the world back home. On Anaximander, Nietzsche writes, he was the first philosophical author of the ancients who wrote engraven, stylized letters, sentence after sentence, the witness to fresh illumination, each the expression of time spent in sublime meditation. In English, Nietzsche's translation of the Justice fragment reads, where the source of things is, to that place they must also pass away, according to necessity, for they must pay penance and be judged for their injustices, according to the ordinance of time. Enigmatic proclamation of a true pessimist, oracular legend over the boundary stone of Greek philosophy, how shall we interpret you? For Nietzsche, Anaximander's doctrine of the apeiron is indeed ontological. Being is eternal and becoming is penance. Logically expressed, yet profoundly illogical, all coming to being is as though it were legitimate emancipation from eternal being. A wrong for which destruction is the only penance. That which truly is, concludes Anaximander, cannot possess definite characteristics, for it would come to be and pass away like all other things. In order that coming to be shall not cease, primal being must be indefinite. Nietzsche thus reads the apeiron as the conscient thing in itself, that is, as a negative theology. The source of all things, being or the apeiron, can be expressed in no definitive predicate, hence its translation by the indefinite or the indeterminate, what Kant called the Ding an sich. Moving from ontology to ethics, or more accurately describing an ontological ethics, Nietzsche reads Anaximander as a somber pessimist. How can anything pass away which has a right to be? In other words, nothing has a right to exist, and everything is guilty by virtue of existing. It is only with death that we receive expiation. According to Nietzsche, Anaximander takes two steps beyond Thales. The many things are not all expressions of the one material substance, but rather are self-contradictory, self-consuming, and self-negating in the face of the infinite. Existence is not justified, but always expiates itself through passing and existing no more. Why then do we exist at all? Why hasn't the many long since passed back into the indefinite? Or in modern scientific terms, what is negentropy and why does it exist? Here Nietzsche reads Anaximander as a mystic. Eternal coming to be must have its origin only in eternal being. We live the conditions of finite individuation, but die into the pre-individual and the indefinite. So much for Nietzsche's vision of Anaximandrian justice. The later article of Heidegger on Anaximander, Der Spruch der Anaximander, or the Verdict of Anaximander, was written in 1946. It's a long text and I've only given us the first few pages to read. Heidegger begins by pointing out that Hermann Diehl's authoritative text appears only a few years after Nietzsche's lectures. Heidegger cites Diehl's translation of the Anaximander fragment as well as Nietzsche's, and begins an extended meditation on the problem of translation. Heidegger critiques Nietzsche's interpretations as superficial. How deep do you have to be to criticize Nietzsche as superficial, huh? And recommends Hegel's deeper understanding of the pre-Socratic, but he also critiques Hegel's pre-Socratics as too Platonic Aristotelian. Heidegger thus defines his project here as recovering what the pre-Socratics had to say in a way that is phenomenological and freed from the historical incrustations of traditional interpretations. Heidegger wants to get back behind the interpreters from whom we derive most of the extant fragments and our usual understanding. Pretty ambitious project. Heidegger wonders whether the first beginning, the dawn of Western thinking, still has mysteries lying in wait, and whether we have so far failed to understand the words and the world of Greek thought. One of Heidegger's lifelong projects is to reject the interpretation of history as historiography, that is, as the history of ideas and figures, dates and major events. Nietzsche's approach is still pretty historiographical for Heidegger. What we should be asking is, what are the major events in the history of thought? Try to date these and situate them in a chronology and thereby project our own worldview and metaphysical assumptions back on the ancient Greeks. What makes the dawn of Greek thinking so important, however, is not that philosophical concepts and proto-science was invented. It is rather their radical communion with being itself, a transformation in the very way of being of humans. There are few times in the deep past when insight into human beings, being itself, and the cosmos burst into existence. When this happens, it is a destiny for us, and we should pay attention. Heidegger thus reads the Arche of Anaximander in terms of the archaeology of the inception of being in human Dasein. For historiography, every beginning has an ending, but for the history of being, or the Seinsgeschichte, every archaeology has an eschatology. It is between the Arche and the eschaton that philosophy, in Heidegger's terms here, phenomenology, takes place. It takes a new mode of approach to recover these fundamental insights and questions, and this is because early Greek thinking has disappeared in a double sense. Not only is the era of Greek thinking long since past, but the texts themselves, except for a few fragments, have disappeared. Nevertheless, what the early Greek thinkers thought lies in wait for us and remains a part of our historical destiny. Heidegger calls this, in Freudian terms, return of the repressed, an eschatology of being, and compares it to what Hegel called the phenomenology of spirit. It is language and listening that are the mediums for archaeology as eschatology, or the Seinsgeschichte for Heidegger. By close attention to the language of the fragments of early Greek thinking, we can be re-engaged in a thoughtful and even poetic dialogue with them. In a way, the most ancient Greeks become ghosts who perpetually haunt thought. This is not a drawback of learning to read the pre-Socratics attentively and thoughtfully, that is, to listen to them, rather a peculiar strength. It teaches us, in the first instance, that any given translation or way of understanding the Greek fragments is already, by and large, arbitrary. We must be willing to leap over an enormous abyss, 2,500 years, in order to hear anything original from their thinking at all. At this point, Heidegger begins a meticulous breaking down of each word of the Anaximander fragment, both the cited line and the framing in the Testimonia, and this exercise goes on for 50 pages. So if you become very interested in this essay and want to work further on it for an essay project or presentation, let me know and I'll send you the whole thing. The three key terms in a more meditative engagement with the Justice fragment for Heidegger are dike, which he translates as jointure or fugue, adikia, injustice or disjointure, and thesis, or paying rec and respect, heeding other beings. Already by these unconventional translations, we are thinking more philosophically. All beings pay rec, respect, and heed each other according to jointure, or the fugue or dance of cosmic justice. Failure to do this is disjointure, or injustice, resulting in dissolution. Heidegger ends up rejecting much of the language, even of the surviving citation, as a later insertion, and focuses in the end, just on 3 or 4 words. Before he does so, however, he gives an original translation of all the cited words, katatokrion didonai gar auta diken, kai tisen alalois tes adikias. This sounds exactly like the ancient Greek concept of isonomia, which we'll study more with Karatani in a little bit. Anaximenes is the last figure we'll look at this week in the earliest phase of Milesian philosophy of nature. He was a probable student of Anaximander, and for him, the material monist principle is that air is the root of all things. The soul is composed of air, rarefied air turns into fire, and when this is condensed, the results are wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. He's famous for his theory of rarefaction and condensation, which is thought to be the first strictly physical account of the relation of things to their primary constituent elements. Once again, what seems on the face of things to a superficial reading to be a strictly scientific philosophy is digging deeper, also religious and spiritual. Anaximenes' air is also breath or soul and spirit. From the Testimonia, as our soul, being air, holds us together, so do breath and air surround the whole universe. Anaximenes' air is clearly in the same vein as religious ideas of the soul or psyche in Greek, and spirit or pneuma. Indeed, many religious philosophies privilege breath as soul spirit as a model for understanding the universe as a whole. Consider, for example, Genesis, where God breathes life into the clay, and Genesis 2, where the biblical prophets on spirit, wind, breath, soul, or the Hebrew ruach, divine inspiration. In his earlier 1926 lectures, Heidegger writes on Anaximenes, also for him, the substrate of nature is one, and that for Anaximenes, each of his predecessors is correct. Thales had posited a determinate matter as the arche, Anaximander an infinite matter. Anaximenes thus reconciles his predecessors in his doctrine of condensation and rarefaction. The most important element from the apeiron or infinite is air, its condensation and rarefaction. All differences now being described as transformation of one homogeneous matter. The primal matter has the same relation to the world as the breath or soul has to human life. For Heidegger, Anaximenes' animation or organism is thus not mythical. So before we transition to our final philosopher on the Milesian philosophy of nature, let's take stock of what we've covered so far. The dominant view since the 19th century has been to read the pre-Socratics as heroes of scientific philosophy versus religion as such, but not as religious thinkers or philosophers of religion. This prejudice is so powerful that the vast majority of philosophy classes that teach the pre-Socratics, or what's left of such classes, rarely points to the profoundly religious basis for pre-Socratic philosophico-religious speculation. They are understood instead as groping inadequately towards scientific method, while still having a few quasi-religious and mythological hiccups. As we've seen so far, the Milesians, and as we'll soon see, all the pre-Socratics cohere in at least two things. One, a search for a natural philosophy, and two, a search for the divinity in nature. Thales' water element is also the divine principle in all things. Anaximander's unlimited is also the divine, deathless, imperishable home of cosmic justice, and Anaximenes' air is also the soul and the world spirit, or what Hegel will eventually call the zeitgeist. I initially assigned all of Karatani's wonderful recent book, and then realized we really only need about 3 chapters of it, not the first couple of chapters. In any case, a few remarks from the introduction are important. Karatani, a Japanese philosopher, is well qualified to evaluate the distinctiveness and specificity of the Greek philosophical revolution versus other innovations of the axial age. A committed Marxist, he notes that Marxists typically see philosophy and religion as part of an ideological superstructure, itself determined by the economic base. Sometimes religious studies scholars attempt to refute Marxism, but when they look at the global axial age revolutions in philosophy and consciousness, they simply can't find any correlative transformation of the economic base to make sense of it. It must have been a spiritual transformation, or against Marxist dogma, an influence from the ideological superstructure. This nicely sets up Karatani's close study of the concepts of isonomia and the origins of Greek philosophy. According to Karatani, there is indeed a suitable explanation of the ideological transformations of the axial period and Greek thought in particular. We just need to be better historians of the social and political transformations of the time in order to find it. What an incredible period of history we find ourselves in when we study the axial age. Although this course is exclusively devoted to ancient Greek philosophy, we probably let what we know or what we could learn about these other traditions suffuse our understanding and procedure as much as possible. Karatani was educated at the University of Tokyo, where he received a BA in economics and an MA in English literature, an unlikely CV for a globally recognized leading philosopher. In 1975, he was invited to Yale to teach Japanese literature as a visiting professor, and there he met Paul de Man and Frederick Jameson and began his work on formalism. And most impressive to me when I read this wiki, he engaged in a formal dialogue with Jacques Derrida, who commented on one of his papers on nationalism and écriture, According to Karatani, Buddha and Lao Tzu were freethinkers who appeared at a time when ancient societies were at a turning point. They later became regarded as religious founders, but it's more correct to see them as freethinkers. And it is from this point of view that Karatani will approach the thinkers of the Ionian city-states. In line with our theme and analysis so far, Karatani concurs it is common practice to locate in Ionian natural philosophy anticipatory thoughts of modern science, while disregarding other aspects. It is as if Ionian thinkers dealt exclusively with physics and were indifferent to things outside that domain. This picture, however, is wholly a prejudice put in place by the Athenian philosophers who came later, such as Plato and Aristotle. Nearly all of what is believed to be distinctive about Greece began in Ionia. Karatani is going to argue for this thesis meticulously, provocatively, and in my view soundly across his book. For example, the revision of Phoenician glyphs to produce an accessible alphabet is often posited as a contributing factor to Greek democracy, but this process began in Ionia. The works of Homer, too, a fount of Greek culture, are written in Ionian dialect. The use of the market, rather than bureaucratic fiat, to regulate prices is also regarded as a contributing factor in bringing about Greek democracy. This, too, is an Ionian development. It was the Ionians who adopted the technology of coining money from neighboring Lydia, and it was the Ionians who became one of the first people to develop foreign trade and a money economy. Furthermore, the technology, religion, and thought of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the ancient Near East intersected in Ionian cities such as Miletus, home of Anaximander, Thales, Anaximenes, as we've just discussed. It is typically claimed that in contrast to older clan societies defined by kinship, the Greek polis was constituted by autonomous individual choice. This did not apply uniformly throughout the Greek city-states. It first appeared in the early colonial cities in Ionia and only expanded from there. It was only later that the principle of a society based on citizenship, not kinship, spread to the Greek mainlands. In a very real sense, Athenian democracy owes its origins to the Ionian city-states such as Miletus. Against tribalism and insularity, philosophy was the invention of immigrants. The idea that democracy began in Athens is certainly a mistake. Although democracy emerges from out of the ancient Ionian idea of isonomia, there are also key differences. Isonomia meaning, according to Hannah Arendt, no rule. That is, equal rule, isonomia, or equal laws, no division between rulers and ruled, and is decisively different than the notion of rule, such as archy, from archine in monarchy or oligarchy, or krasi, from kratine in democracy. Isonomia thus seems more related to an early anarchism, rather than to the pitfalls and perils in democracy that would eventually creep in, namely mere rule by the majority will. Isonomia emerged as a form of political government in the Ionian city-states because they were migrants without existing clan and tribal traditions. Karatani situates Socrates within the Ionian legacy of individualism, more a citizen of the cosmos within the polis than anything else. In his analysis of the Milesians, Karatani attempts to reforge the link between natural philosophy and social philosophy. In the Anaximander fragment, there's a dissonance in applying words such as recompense and restitution to nature. However, if we take Anaximander's words as a statement of social philosophy, we can discern a denunciation of tyranny and class and a call for the restitution of isonomia. For Karatani, the key innovation of Ionian natural/social philosophy is its conception of matter as self-moving. On this note, and at first glance, it looks like Anaximander's Apeiron is more profound than Thales' water, but why then did the later thinkers return to Thales and a concrete material arche? For Karatani, this is because Anaximander's Apeiron was still a restatement of mythological ideas. To really transcend mythology, it's necessary once again to assert that matter was moved not by the gods, but of itself. Ionian material monism, eventually turning into pluralism as we'll study in future weeks, essentially undermined the mythological view of nature in favor of a new kind of participatory social philosophy. And it was not until Aristotle's notion of the fourfold causality, especially the final cause, function, or purpose, and the uncaused cause of God, that philosophy's ground in both nature and society became uprooted in favor of metaphysics or a natural theology. After the metaphysical theologies of Plato and Aristotle became dominant, the natural philosophy of the pre-Socratics, from Thales to Democritus, was pushed into oblivion, and it would not be until the European Renaissance that it came to be reassessed. What broke the long dominance of Aristotelian speculation was the reintroduction of Ionian natural philosophy. You can find it above all in heretic Giordano Bruno, burnt at the stake, who asks us to grab the significance of natura naturans, or the nature that produces nature, what the pre-Socratics had called self-moving nature. Karatani comments, through Bruno, matter as self-generating nature was resurrected, hence Bruno is subject even today to the same accusations as the Ionian thinkers, that is, that he was a magical thinker who took matter to be animated. After Bruno, it was Spinoza who most comprehensively developed the idea of natura naturans, or a nature that produces nature. In Spinoza's thought, self-producing nature is God, whereas the personified God is only an imaginary projection modeled on one's family experience. Spinoza's critique of anthropomorphism also owing a significant debt to Xenophanes of Colophon, who we'll study next week. Crucial for our study of the Milesians, according to Karatani, is to note that they reject the idea of a final cause. Nature's becoming of itself differs from making precisely because it has no cause or aim. They don't need to explain techne or fabricated objects as a separate sphere from physis or natural objects. Inventiveness or creativity, poesis, is part of nature's becoming. It acts out in the human sphere, but is far from being limited to it. The rest of Karatani's chapter here goes into material we'll be covering further in following weeks, so see these slides and the rest of the chapter as an introduction for now, which we'll return to as we flesh out the picture of all the pre-Socratic philosophers in the coming weeks. Thanks for listening and have a great week.